Okay, let's see. Sly Marbo. Well, I've heard of him, but I don't know much about him. Why is there so much redacted? Was only answers to one person? Maybe there's more information in his file here. Maybe we can get some kind of answers there? I don't know. What's with all this gunk? More black tape? And this whole page is blacked out? I don't even need it. Oh, okay. Yeah, we're just gonna pretend we didn't look in here, and we'll put this over here, I guess. Yeah. How about we just paint him anyway, huh? Hey guys, welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and skits aside, let's go ahead and get into painting what is essentially the Rambo of Warhammer 40k, Sly Marbo. Honestly, I have always thought this miniature was really cool, and when it got re-released a few years ago back when the game store was still open, I went ahead and snagged up 2 of them because I thought they would be so much fun to paint. And as it turns out, I was right. Oftentimes with Warhammer, I often think things are going to be really enjoyable, and then because of the sculpt and because of the posing, that painting them can end up being a little bit difficult, and it's not as fun as I hoped it would be. With this sculpt, it was pretty awesome. So let's crack into it. Let's see how I painted it. Today is not really a proper tutorial, although I will explain every step along the way as to what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Just know that today is not going to be a traditional tutorial with all of the names and everything on screen, and that's just because I'm a little pressed for time this week. Hope you guys understand. Alright, first and foremost, you guys know me. If there is relatively decent box art, I try to stick to that box art. And with Sly Marbo, there is some amazing box art, but as we all know, the box art tends to lie. When it has that recommended color chart that tells you all the colors that GW claims you should be able to use in order to paint what you see on the box art, 9 times out of 10 it's wrong. There either isn't enough colors, they're completely different colors, or it's just the very beginning of what you need, and in reality it just doesn't quite work out in the wash. Now starting off here, I'm using Abaddon Black to do his tank top, and I'm going to be highlighting that simply by adding a little bit of white. Now if you don't want to go ahead and mix colors, you could use something like Scavenge Blight Dinge mixed with a little bit of Dawnstone, and you'll get pretty close to the color that I end up using. If you want a really vibrant highlight, I recommend just going with Dawnstone, or maybe even a very thin edge highlight with a pure white. Now because of how much exposed skin tone there is on this miniature, I wanted to go ahead and start blocking that out now with Bugman's Glow. My big reason for this is I didn't want to overpower it with a similar looking color later on in my painting process, because I need his face and his muscles to kind of be one of the highlights of this miniature, and I don't want to distract from that, so I went ahead and started working on that now. Now the pants color on the box art was closer to Lauren Forest. However, I knew with all the washes and everything that I was going to want to put on this that Deathworld Forest was going to be a great starting point. However, I wanted to go ahead and water this down almost into a glaze-like consistency. I kind of almost pushed this to the point of contrast paints, as you'll notice that it doesn't really stick to the highest recesses. It doesn't stick to the highest points on the miniature. And this is for a few different reasons, but my biggest one is it's going to make it a little easier to go ahead and pick out those edge highlights later. Now, my edge highlights were a combination of using Deathworld Forest and Moot Green mixed in a 50-50 blend, as well as that blend mixed in a 50-50 blend with a little bit of yellow. Now, honestly, any color yellow outside of Averland Sunset will work just fine. Any kind of a nice bright yellow will get you there. And we're also going to be using those same green blends, including the yellow blend, on all of the forest floor stuff that's underneath him. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. Working quickly with the Thonian camo shade, it's going to fill in those recesses and make everything look nice. It's also going to tint the surface on those highest most points and kind of get everything back into that green spectrum where we want it. Now I need to work quickly, as if I mush the brush around a little too much, it is going to pick up that previous green, as I did just kind of set it using a hairdryer and it hasn't properly cured yet. And now is a unfortunately long and boring part. So we're gonna skip past a bunch of this, but just know that I ended up putting about 6 layers worth of glazing of this Kislev flesh skin tone. To have avoided this, what I probably should have done is mixed a little bit of Kislev into my Bugman's Glow and used that as my base tone, and then did my highlight of Kislev. Now the trick to getting a similar effect to what I ended up achieving is not going all the way into the recesses. When we pick out all these different sculpts of the muscles, we're going right up to the edge and we're leaving just a little bit of that Bugman's Glow kind of peeking out from the cracks and crevices of his muscles. And the way we're going to blend this all together is using Guilliman's Flesh from the contrast paint line that's going to help blend everything together, and it's going to add a warmth back into the skin that isn't there. It's going to make it feel like he's been out in the sun a little bit, or at the very least in this jungly environment where he's either in the shade or he's in the sun. There is no in between. Now, if you've been following the channel for any kind of serious amount of time, you'll know that I tend to use contrast paints very similar to how I use inks, in the sense that I do a nice, very thin all-over coat. I very rarely let things pool in the recesses. I very rarely just kind of gunk it on, which is kind of how they sold contrast paints to begin with. You know, the old commercial of one thick coat. Well, we're going away from what I like to do, and we are just kind of slapping it on like a general wash. We're putting this all over the skin tones, we're making sure it settles in those recesses, but we want to make sure it doesn't pool. If you notice it's pooling, go ahead and wick a little bit away with a relatively dry brush, but for the most part we want to go ahead and make sure it gets all over everything when it comes to this flesh tone. Now, if you guys know me, I tend to like realism as much as I can. However, I really like this almost cartoonish style blonde hair. So we're going to be using Laminer's Yellow on top of Kislev Flesh. And then just to add a little bit of recess shading back into all of the hair, we're going to be using Seraphim Sepia all over that. Now, this isn't a perfect blonde tutorial, and honestly just putting Seraphim Sepia on top of Kislev does a really great job at kind of getting a realistic blonde like finish, but I really like putting that Laminer's Yellow in there because it does kind of give this almost anime cartoon-esque vibe to it. Next, it was time to go ahead and start putting down some browns on the leather. Now, I chose Mournfang just because I wanted it to be a nice deep red. I wanted it to be a little bit more vibrant than the box art. However, we are going to go a little bit brighter on the edge highlights than what the box art is. And we're basically going to be using Xandri Dust. Now, I am out of Xandri Dust, so I'll be having to mix that with a little bit of white and XV88 put together, but we're basically shooting for that khaki Xandri Dust color. Now this guy has a few ribbons hanging from him, one with his bandana around his head, one around his hip that's hanging from the holster, and one that is on the back of the sword. And so I'm going to go ahead and paint that up with Blood Angel Red from the contrast line. Now you could use whatever reds that you want. I will not be highlighting this red, which is why I'm using contrast paints to let that edge be just a little bit brighter than the surrounding areas. If I was going to highlight this, then I probably would have started off with Corn Red and then moved in through Mephiston and then highlighted with something like Jericho Orange. However, because I'm just wanting to go ahead and get this done and I'm a little scrapped for time, we're going to go ahead and use the Blood Angel Red. For the cigar in his mouth, I painted it with Mournfang Brown, and then I 50-50 highlighted the tip using Jericho Orange and Uriel Yellow. I mixed a small amount of my Uriel Yellow in with my Deathworld Forest and got a slightly brighter tone than what the pants had ended up with after all of my shading, so I went ahead and started working on the highlights there. Now, unfortunately, the footage was lost of me painting the orc's head as well as the plant body that is on the back side of the base. But I just used orc flesh from the contrast paint line for both of those, and then washed both of them in Colia green shade. I used Bugman's Glow to add a little pop of color to the plant's lips as well as to the decapitated head of the orc. Now I also used a mixture of Bugman's Glow as well as some red and white mixed for a bright pink for all the fleshy bits on the back of the head. However, that pretty much ended up getting entirely covered up once I went ahead and put my blood effect on, but depending on how much blood you're wanting to add after the fact, you may see this as a worthwhile thing to invest your time in. Working my way up through the highlights for both the orc head and the plant, I'm starting with moot green and I'm slowly adding more and more yellow, and I'm applying this as a glaze into selected areas. Now I'm not wanting to add too many highlights to the orc head as it's not really a point of focus. It's more or less just a bit of terrain. However, with the plant, I went ahead and I took him to the next step by adding more and more yellow to him, especially when it comes to the plants that are on the base. Later on, once we start to paint those, I end up going back in with that moot green and slowly adding up more and more yellow to the point where almost the edges of the leaves are almost a bright yellow. For the vines on the base, I went ahead and thinned down some moot green almost to the point of a wash. Now I did darken this a little bit with some Caliban green, but that was just because I had it on my palette already. You don't really need to do that. I wasn't really super concerned about anywhere where the color wasn't sticking, however, because I plan to go ahead and glaze in some yellow later on for my highlights, and so anywhere where the green isn't sticking now is just going to get turned yellow, so I really wasn't worried about getting an all over coat. Same thing with the big giant leaf that is underneath his feet as well. Now at this point, everything got hosed down with Athonian camo shade when it came to the base, both the leaves, the vines, and even the bottom half of the little plant guy, the little Venus flytrap. This would help add a little bit of shadow to him as well, but it was also going to set all of our tones for the rest of the base. Now before I started adding all of my yellow glazes to the plant life, I really wasn't happy with how green the rock was looking, so I went ahead and mixed up a bit of a gray glaze to kind of lay in on top of everything and to get that rock looking back more like rock. Now I could have gone a little bit brighter with this and then used some other washes like Seraphim Sepia, Fugan Orange, Nuln Oil, Agrax Earthshade, that sort of thing to kind of really give those earthy tones and to make it look like there are minerals in the rock. However, this really isn't a showpiece. This is just a piece to go in my army, and although it is a showpiece in the army, it doesn't need like a museum level paint job, so I really wasn't overly concerned about making sure everything looked as perfect as it could. But if you really wanted to take this to that next stage and you really wanted your base to pop, I really recommend going with like Dawnstone and then adding a lot of washes on top of it. Now I decided to go ahead and start painting the Dynamite Plunger. Now I went ahead and painted the base of this with red, Mephiston red specifically, and then I used Jericho Orange with a little bit of Uriel Yellow mixed in to get a nice bright highlight. I then painted the wires and the plunger itself using Abaddon Black. Now you could use whatever colors you want. I typically would imagine using black and red for the wires for a hot and neutral. That's an electrical term, but honestly just two black wires would get the point across, which was why I didn't really worry about it too much. So now I was starting to put on some of those final touches, and I went ahead and I wanted to make the handle on the sword Abaddon Black. Now I'm not going to really add any highlights to this, but you could if you really wanted to. In the concept art on the box art, it is Abaddon Black, there is no doubt about that, but they do appear to have highlighted it with a gray, so my recommendation again would be either a Dawnstone or a Scavenge Blight Dinge, but that's just a little too over the top for a minor detail that's not super important. Now we're back on working on the base. You can see that when I'm kind of working under the gun, I'm not really working methodically. I'm just going from piece to piece. Okay, this is still wet, so I want to work far away from this, and this is still wet, so I want to work far away from that. So now I'm working back on the plant life underneath his feet, and we're just glazing in that yellow mixture like I talked about before. Nothing magical here, but we're focusing a lot of it on the leaves as well, and this is going to make them feel really vibrant and alive. Now also there is a few spots on the leaves where the wash, the Athonian Camo Shade, has pooled, and in those places I'm just glazing a small amount of morphing brown on top of it to kind of give the illusion that maybe it is starting to rot. Now here I'm knocking out all of the metallics, the gun in his hand, his sword, the grenades on his pouch, pretty much anything that I think would be a metallic color. I'm going ahead and painting those. Now I ended up using my favorite gunmetal gray as well as my favorite silver from Vallejo. That is the model color line, or the metal color line, and it is a alcohol based pigment, so you really want to make sure that that's nice and dry before you put anything else on top of it. Then when it comes to the weapon, I went ahead and took the grip and the suppressor as well as the scope, and I painted those with matte black. And around the suppressor, I went ahead and put some beading around there to just kind of make it look as though maybe it was a ribbed material. And I did that using Scavenge Blight Dinge. And here I'm just doing some final touches, and I'm using that Xandri Dust color to add some final highlights to the leather. And I just want to let you know that the brighter the color is and the closer to white that you get, the more worn out it's going to look. So if you wanted to give this a real heavy, worn out look, you may want to go a little bit heavier with the khaki colors and then add a little white and add a secondary highlight, and that'll really help things to look a little bit more worn out. Now in my case, I didn't want to push it that far, as the box art doesn't have it that far as well, and I wanted to keep this a little bit more akin to the box art. And there you have it, guys. Sly Marbo, an excellent collection to any Astra Militarum army or anyone that you could take him with. Now if this was one of your first videos watching me, I apologize. Today was a bit of a let's paint. I don't typically do these too often, and when I do traditional tutorials, or traditional for this channel, I tend to put a lot of the information on screen just for those of you guys who are following along. It makes things a little bit easier to understand what I'm saying and doing. But today was for me, and this is a miniature that's been sitting on my shelf for a while, and I thought he'd be a lot of fun to work on. And it turns out I was right. In any case, I hope you guys have enjoyed the video, and as always, may your display case always be filled, and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.